Well, first of all, we would like to thank you for inviting us to the conference. It's a great honor for us to participate. And just for information, our contribution with the title Where Are the Women? Architectural Canon and the Periodicals is a collective work and will be presented by all three authors. My name is Klára Brůhová, and I will start, and then I will hand over to my colleagues. Please, second slide. As an introduction, I would like to begin with one of the most important questions that feminist-oriented research has been asking since the second wave of feminism, which is, why are women disappearing from the public space and from general knowledge? When Linda Nochlin, in her well-known essay back in 1971, asked, why have there been no great women artists, she described for the first time how structural barriers prevented women from making a significant impact in the visual arts. And we are asking a similar question, but focusing on the situation in architecture, specifically in Czech architecture during the last 2 decades of 20th century. Our basic question is, what is the anatomy of the disappearance of women from the architectural canon, and what are its causes? In the first part of the presentation, I will introduce our methodology and briefly summarize the quantitative part of the analysis. And then I will hand it over to my colleagues who will present our findings that we have detected as reasons for the disappearance of women from the discourse. And also, as authors of the presentation, we consider it important to outline our position in the given issue. All three of us are active in a Czech architectural scene as architects, theoreticians, and historians, and thus our interpretations reflect this position and our own experience. Please, the next slide. About the methodology and research questions. We chose to focus on the period of 1980s and 1990s, mainly because we wanted to compare the presentation of women architects in state socialism, it is until 1989, and during the period of emerging capitalism in 1990s. The method we chose was a content and discursive analysis of professional magazines that shaped the architectural discourse in our country at that time. The magazines are namely Architektura ČSR, Československý Architekt, and Architekt. English translations of the names are on the slide. Well, those were the most widespread and most important architectural periodicals in the Czech Republic of those days, and they were intended to represent not only important projects and studies, but also opinions and debates. So the content of these magazines largely determined the idea of architect's image and good architecture in the eyes of public. What we did is to look at these magazines from a gender perspective and ask to what extent and in what ways women architects and their work are represented on their pages. Next slide, please. We used the magazines as a basis for quantitative analysis that was conducted in selected volumes and in several categories. We chose for this presentation 2 key categories, which we concerned with, which are connected with questions: who is given voice in the magazines as first one, and whose names are made visible as the second question. Next slide, please. So to the first question, who is given voice? According to our findings, the representation of women architects in interviews, discussions, or comment sections in the pages of these magazines was rather low, as you can see for yourself on the slide. We also noticed that when women have been invited into debates, it has often been not because of their views on design or architecture itself, but because of their expertise in specific areas, typically architectural education, conservation, or other pretty narrowly focused research. It is also interesting to compare the pre- and post-revolutionary representation of women in opinion panels. The highest representation of women who were asked for their opinion in the pages of the magazines was in the second half of the 1980s. In the 1990s, their voice was heard less, even though the discussions and comment sections were given more space. In 1994, for example, a number of critics shared their views on the results of the Grand Prix, which is a prize for the best architectural projects built in Czech Republic. In the first years, there was always one or two women among around 20 critics commenting on that prize. But later, in the second half of the 1990s, the women disappeared completely. And basically, they lost opportunity to comment on the results of this very important competition. Next slide, please. And to the second question, whose names are made visible? Across the magazines appear also a number of biographical articles which inform the readers about the life and work of prominent architects. In each volume of each magazine, we found several dozen of biographical texts dedicated to domestic and foreign architectural masters of various historical epochs. However, as you can again see for yourself on the slide, women are practically completely missing. And now I would like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Šárka Malošíková, who will guide you through the next section, which focuses on the presentation of architects as creators of architectural works.
Hello. So we detected a disproportion between the names of men and women, not only in biographical texts on which we focus in the final part of our presentation, but also, for example, in lists of authors and co-authors of architectural works. In the 1980s, for published works, magazines often listed only the names of team leaders and principal authors, accompanied with et al. And since women rarely worked in leadership positions, their names almost never made it among named authors. In the post-revolutionary magazine Architekt, the names of authors and co-authors are more consistently listed in the projects presented. However, the authorship is reduced in the subsequent project presentation. I will show you the example of Jana Vodičková, which illustrates some of the reasons for the disappearance of women architects from the architectural canon. In the 1990s, Vodičková worked in the AP Atelier, many of whose works were awarded in the aforementioned Grand Prix. In this slide, there are photos directly from the magazine, and as you see, all the architects are presented here, main authors first. It's a town hall project that won the top prize, and a villa project. Next slide, please. They were, however, published in the magazine a year earlier. In the text, or even in one of the article title, they were presented only as the work of Blescott and Lampa. The main authors and the names of Vodičková and other authors were given only at the end among the project summary. Next slide, please. In the case of the villa, she was mentioned as the author of its interior, but again only in the project summary, although there is a whole page devoted to interior photos. In the months following the announcement of the Grand Prix, regular evaluation of the competition results was published, in which the critics reduced the authorial collective again to its two principal authors. The villa and town hall projects are mentioned again in 1999 in a retrospective issue where critics select the most important projects of the past decade. Here, however, we can already find the name Jana Vodičková-Kantorová because the architect had married in the meantime. And for the subsequent projects published in the press, she began to use only the second surname Kantorová. The example illustrates three themes that are relevant to our question about the disappearance of women. The first is the reduction of authorship to only selected figures of award-winning collectives by the creators of architectural discourse, despite the effort of some of the leaders of these collectives to consistently list all of their collaborators. Second, the example shows the lower prestige and with it the importance of authorship of interior design when the house and interior are designed by a single author collective. And third, the change of surname after marriage worsens the perception of continuity of the architect's work. Next slide, please. However, during a thorough study of the magazines, we came across one case in which the representation of women was significantly higher than usual. In 1994, Architekt magazine started awarding its own prize. During the first 6 years, 4 women won it. The first one was Hana Zachová for the reconstruction of the stone pavement in Český Krumlov. In the magazine, we learn about the award from the speech by the magazine's editor-in-chief, who speaks of Zachová's work as follows. From the heights of ambitious creativity, the architect brings us back to earth, in this case literally. If I could allow myself to make a comparison in your presence, then the prize of our magazine goes today to an architect, worker of the city, end quote. The following year, the prize was given to the duo Petra Hlaváčková and Hana Mincová for the reconstruction of an apartment building in Brno, which is highlighted in the pages of the magazine as a sensitive reconstruction where no major changes were made, which means again a project free of ambitious creativity. In the following years, the award had moved away from architects. In 1996, it was awarded to Sonja Rindová for her management of the Fragna Gallery in Prague, a space dedicated to the presentation of architecture, and in 1999 to Alica Štefančíková as the initiator and organizer of creative informal architectural meetings of the younger generation of architects, mostly men, in the late 1980s. Thus, both of them received the award for enabling important personalities of the architectural scene to present their work and attitudes. The prize demonstrates that if the evaluation criteria are changed, in this case shaped by the editorial board of a magazine focused on the representation and mediation of architectural events, even invisible people whose work would otherwise stand in the shadow of actors in the forefront of architectural scene, or who often help these actors to establish themselves in the field, will receive awards. I now turn the floor over to a colleague, Petra Hlaváčková, who will focus on biographical articles and gender stereotypes.
Hello. Okay, I will continue. Next, it's okay, the slide. Okay, thank you. In our research, we also focused on biographical text and sought to answer the question, how is it possible that the tendency to single out one creator at the expense of his collaborators has such cultural normative force? We focus on how the image of the great architect is formed. Indeed, across the magazine volumes, there are numerous biographical articles devoted exclusively to male architects, in which the widespread stereotype prevails that for great architects, genius was a fundamental prerequisite for their future success. Linda Nochlin, in her aforementioned text, draws attention to the stereotypical legends about the birth of great creators whose innate talent was recognized by insightful patrons. In this context, however, she argues that the romantic notion of the autonomous genius is at its core elitist, as it often neglects the circumstances and context within which the person in question acts and creates. For Nochlin, the absence of women in the canon of art history is not due to a lack of talent, but precisely to the circumstances that did not, and often still do not, allow them to self-realize and gain recognition, such as the second shift or the rigid nature of the architecture profession. Next, please. Another accompanying feature of most of the biographies analyzed is the emphasis on the individual performance of a given architect without the help of others. They do not pay attention to the co-authors of the projects. For example, in a major biographical text on the centenary of Le Corbusier's birth, entitled Le Corbusier 100 Years, or on the social usefulness of brilliant architects, Charlotte Perriand, Eileen Gray, or Jane Drew are forgotten, and Pierre Jeanneret is mentioned only in passing. This fetish of the individual creator is twice unfair to women architects. It is much more difficult for women to become such a great individual, and at the same time, the contribution of those women architects who have been involved as co-authors is erased, as illustrated by the example of architect Vodičková. Next, please. Another topic that caught our attention while studying the magazines was the gender stereotypes associated with the presentation of women. As we already mentioned, female personalities and architects are minimally present in the magazines. Especially in the post-revolutionary era, it is evident from the pages of Architekt magazine that the architectural scene has become almost exclusively a man's world. A free terrain opened up for young architects where the older generation prominent during the state socialism was no longer so active. And they, as the heroes of the Velvet Revolution, could take the lead and shape the discourse. The actors on the scene know each other, even from informal meetings. They recommend each other for the invited competitions and juries. In this respect, it is hard not to wonder how many talented female architects, wives of these active, well-connected men, were staying at home and looking after their children. Next, please. The problems with the lack of opportunities for professional interaction for women in masculine environments and the resulting gender inequalities are all the more pronounced when we encounter the recurring names of just a few women. Only Alena Šrámková and Eva Jiřičná were presented in an established position in the 90s. Their names often function as a proof that well-known and respected women architects are present in the Czech architecture discourse, and therefore it is only a question of hard work and strong will to become one. Next, please. Of the few women's voices that are heard in the pages of Architekt, a large number belong to foreign female architects, as if the Western experience itself elevates women in the hierarchy. However, even foreigners have no escaped stereotyping and objectification. For example, a photograph of the Japanese architect Itsugo Hasegawa is accompanied by a caption that would probably not have been made about any man. When I asked Miss Itsugo Hasegawa if she knew any Czech architecture, she fell silent and hid her face in her hands as an expression of a negative answer. The lens, however, captured Miss Itsugo already smiling. In the rare occasions when Czech women architects are given space, they are usually concise and pragmatic in their statements. References to the second shift appear here and there in the interviews, such as the one from 1987 with Dagmar Polsarová, where she says, "I probably won't say anything revolutionary. First of all, it is not easy to combine work and other interests. It takes time to take care of a family." End of quotation. In an interview with Pavla Kordovská about the project for a saving bank, the very first question is about the division of time between caring of the family and the project. Unlike the interview from the same period with her husband, also an architect, that sticks exclusively to the professional topic. Next, please. In the section from society, women appear mainly as admirers, wives of prominent men, or students of architecture. It is not uncommon for their grace and charm to be mentioned. The gender imbalance in the pages of Architekt magazine in the 90s is in fact already visible at first sight. The photographs, portraits, discussion, meetings, lectures show mostly men, very often in convivial, informal conversation. This makes the cases where a woman is depicted, often uncovered as part of an advertisement, stand out all the more. And the photographic nude accompanying a professional article is no exception. In conclusion, our analysis of the magazines mentioned above has shown in more detail how gendered and different the presentation of women architects is, and what kind of obstacles women working in this field have to overcome, from exclusion from men's clubs to the many stereotypes associated with their work. These facts further influence the absence of women in leadership positions and, as a consequence, their invisibility in the non-stating co-authorship in published projects. However, women who have managed to break through in this masculine world have not, in principle, challenged this exclusionary system, and have also usually been able to draw on an unusually strong background in the form of a partner as an established architect or foreign Western experience. Next, please. We found that the individualistic model of the architect as a genius creator was not as strong in the 80s, and women were more likely to appear in the role of experts. After the Velvet Revolution, however, gender inequalities become more pronounced, and some become explicit, given the reinforcement of masculine models and pervasive sexism. Next. This is eloquently captured in this 1991 advertisement for positions at the Research Institute of Construction and Architecture, which directly states, "Preference given to men with experience and knowledge of English." Thank you for your attention.